How can we best respond to suicide grief? That's the topic that we're going to address today on Flourish-Meant. I'm your host, Tina Yeager. And today I have a very special guest with me. Her name is Tracie Peterson, and she is known as the queen of historical fiction. She's written over 140 books, and her latest series dives into some very gritty, very deep topics, and her research has made her an expert on these. So she's here to talk about those from a historical and contemporary viewpoint. Welcome, Tracie. I am delighted to have you on Flourish-Meant today.
Thank you so much, Tina. I'm glad to be here. I don't know that I would qualify myself as any kind of expert, though. I have done research, and that's always near and dear to my heart. So we will go with that.
Well, Tracie, if you wouldn't mind getting started with why you felt moved to include the topic of suicide in your recent novel.
About a year ago, a family member committed suicide, and we've had other suicide situations with friends and family members, church people that we cared deeply about, that kind of thing. And so it's something that has kind of been around to cause me to ask questions, to seek research, as I listen to different people talk about it, especially then, in the Christian circles. And so as I started, researching it, I could see way back, for all time, suicide has had such a stigma and has been such a difficult topic of conversation. And of course, it causes such pain and such frustration to those who are left behind. And I just thought, in this fictional setting, I wanted to create a character who was dealing with that aftermath and try to bring in biblical truth surrounding it.
Tracie, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you addressing this difficult topic in fiction. Often we'll be able to heal through story, and you may have seen this happen before through some of your novels. Can you talk about the healing power that we have in that space of reading a novel that might be different than therapy?
Sure. I think there is a casualness with reading and yet an intimacy that allows us to kind of let down our guard and be ourselves as we pick up something as simple as fiction. We're looking for escape. We're looking for a good read or whatever. I know that my readers are used to my encouragement and sharing biblical truth and having a happy ending. So they tell me, I read your books because I know I can count on getting that. And so my hope was that as I dealt with this topic, that people who were maybe turned off by it or afraid of it even would go the distance because they knew they could trust me in the content that I would put in my books. And so I saw this as a way to kind of deal with the topic without it being so heavy-handed or even maybe intrusive, because I know so many times I hear people, well, I tried counseling, but it was so invasive and so intrusive, and I just didn't feel comfortable. And so in this situation, they can read about someone else going through a similar situation. And there's a lot of truth in the characters that I present. I pull from experience of my own dealing with suicide or friends who have dealt with suicide, family members and whatnot. And so each of the characters has that truth in them, even though it is a work of fiction.
Now, I know you would agree with me. We're not advocating that this is taking place of counseling or better than counseling. It's just a different way of engaging in conversation with people. And sometimes people aren't ready to deal with things in that very in-your-face format of counseling and opening those truths. But story has a way of being gentler and a way of bridging those gaps and reaching out to people who might not otherwise access a direct message, a nonfiction message, or even talking to some other person in person about this, right?
I totally agree. Therapy and talking to someone is vital. I really do believe that, when you're dealing with something as overwhelming as suicide, that, you need to reach out and get the kind of qualified help that is out there. And yet, like you said, reading can be a way to come to that point where you feel like you really can take it forward or deal with it. In the past, there's been so much negativity, and even now with suicide, that you find some of the Christians even being really rather cruel about people and the topic of suicide. And as I was researching in history, especially this was true, people who committed suicide couldn't even be buried in the church cemetery because they were considered to be godless or, hopeless because they had taken their life. And, there were all these stigmas associated with that and problems that people encountered. So in my story, this was a secret that three people were trying to keep in order to have that stigma as far removed from them as possible. And yet it was a secret that was eating them alive. And I think a lot of times we see that in the lives of people who, have someone they care deeply about who has killed themselves, and they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to deal with it. They just want to make it go away. And that can be so very hard to help them heal because they're covering this up and pressing it down and whatnot. So my hope is that this story would show some of those mistakes, some of those bad attitudes, and also show the encouragement that we can take from the Word of God.
Tracie, thank you for bringing hope and encouragement to those who've experienced such unnecessary shame, so much silencing and quiet in a place where there really needs to be conversation and support. I know as a therapist that grief on its own is difficult enough, it's painful enough. But when you complicate that with the trauma that's created around suicide, then that grief is compounded. It's what we call compounded grief. And that is another whole huge thing. And then you add secrecy to it, and that makes it even more painful. Can you talk about how you addressed the pain in this historical novel?
I thought a lot about that with the various things that I was going through in my own life and things of past experiences. And I know that when you take that grief and just sit on it and absorb it into yourself and feed yourself on that day after day after day, you begin to die and the hope in you dies. And so I encouraged my characters to reach out, to talk, even when the situation was difficult and hard, to be willing to bring in someone who they trusted, that they could at least speak what they were feeling and going through. And I have encouraged people, if you don't feel comfortable with the people that are in your immediate circle, reach out to a therapist, reach out to your pastor, reach out to those people who are trained and able to take on that burden. But I have found in my situation, because I've got good, godly people in my life, that by just letting myself be vulnerable and speak what's going on in my heart, that it's been tremendously healing. And just the feeling that someone else cares and that they're bearing that burden with me. And so I showed this in the form of my characters.
Tracie, can you talk about the titles of this series and where they can find copies of these novels for themselves so the audience can access them?
This is the Hope of Cheyenne series, and book one is called A Constant Love, and that's the book we're talking about today. And then books 2 and 3 come out in July and October. And this is a series that is actually a sequel series that follows a series called The Heart of Cheyenne. And it picks up about 20 years later with some of the same characters, but there's a lot of new characters too.
I hope that all of you listening have gained some hope and some insight as a result of our very vital conversation with Tracie Peterson. And of course, I also hope that you will come back for the next episode of Flourish-Meant.